First of all, my name is Vanessa Harding. I'm the chair of the Historic Towns Trust, and I'd like to welcome you all to the online launch of the historical map of Chester. If I can just start with a couple of housekeeping issues, please make sure you stay on mute while everything's going on, and I'll be explaining about putting the questions into the chat later on. If you have any tech issues, for example, that you can't hear or something's going wrong, please either email Martin Wills, our development manager. His address is development@historictownstrust.uk, or chat direct with him in the chat. That's Martin Wills. I should also remind you that this is being recorded and it will be available on the YouTube channel of the Historic Towns Trust after the event. So I'd like to thank you all for coming, for being interested in the new historical map of Chester. In particular, I'd like to thank all of those who've contributed to bringing the map to publication, and especially the University of Chester, whose early commitment and generous funding really made it happen. The Historic Towns Trust is a charity with a mission to support and promote research into the history and topography of cities and towns in Great Britain, and to help people to understand the richness of our urban heritage. Every town has a history, and the evolution of its built form tells that story. Not everywhere has as long a history as Chester, with its notable Roman past, as well as its medieval and early modern importance, but there are always points of interest and significance. Towns change in character and function over the centuries, with different periods of growth and prosperity, and different responses to external influences such as population growth, the Industrial Revolution, or the coming of the railways. So an historical map that puts past and present together and shows how they've interacted is a unique illumination of the events and influences that have shaped the town. It helps us to understand who lived here and how the town worked in the past, and we hope it can stimulate thinking about how we want the town to be now and in the future. At the Historic Towns Trust, we aim to fulfill our mission by creating and publishing high-quality historical maps and atlases of Britain's towns and cities. All of our publications are produced in collaboration with local experts, societies, and funders. So far, we've produced atlases and/or maps of 25 British cities and towns. Chester is number 20 in our Town and City Historical Maps series. We have another map in press, an atlas underway, and several other projects in development. We're part of a wider European project under the auspices of the International Commission for the History of Towns, established in the aftermath. Sorry, can you mute? Thanks. Established in the aftermath of the Second World War to record, explain, and help to preserve our urban past and our understanding of it. The project has moved at different speeds in different countries, partly depending on funding models and official commitment. The British project started quite early, but has moved slowly without any official funding from the state or other body. But in the last 10 years, we have reorganized ourselves and greatly increased the speed of production. One development that the British project has initiated is the production of folding maps as well as large folio atlases. And this has enabled us to engage with many more communities and, as we hope, reach a wider range of people than atlases alone, though atlases do remain our landmark publications. The maps are all at the common scale of 1 to 2,500, which is about 25 inches to the mile. And this is shared across the whole European Atlas project to enable comparison. And this means that we can look at Chester in context and compare it and its history with other early settlements, port towns, county towns, and so on. Although our maps share a similar appearance and colouring, there's considerable variation in what we include, particularly on the reverse of the map, to reflect local features, knowledge, and points of significance. There's a lot of detail which repays close study. Our maps are created, as here, in partnership with local groups or individuals in whom the real knowledge of the locality resides and who are best placed to ensure the local impact of the published map. They're also best placed to fundraise for the map project. Every project has to be self-funded, so we rely on donors to make them happen, and we gratefully thank those present or listening in for their contribution. As you will have seen, our geographical coverage is patchy. We're keen to fill gaps in regions and also in different types of towns. We have a lot of towns. We have a list of towns we would be keen to work on, but we're also very responsive to proposals. The more people know about our maps, the more they will think, why can't we have one? And the more we can expand our activity. So with that plug for the Historic Towns Trust, I will hand over to my colleagues. We'll have a few words first from Professor Paul Bissell, Professor of Public Health and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation at the University of Chester. Paul.
Thanks, Vanessa. So I'm delighted to be working with the Historic Towns Trust to produce this really excellent historical map of Chester. One of the things that really makes me proud here at Chester is our fantastic history team, and I hope Tom and Katherine are blushing at this point, and they are the ones who've led on this project. They really are two of the most excellent staff we've got at the university, and they make the research, the knowledge exchange, and what I'd call thought leadership really, really first rate here. And not only are Katherine and Tom recipients of really prestigious arts and humanities research grants, not easy things to get in this world, as we know. They also do a huge amount of outreach work with the local communities that we serve as a local regional university. They really do bring to life their discipline with local people in and around Chester. For them, and I think for us, history is not just some dry discipline gathering dust in the corner of the room, but it's a vibrant and bright subject that sheds new light on who we were and who we are and how we're developing. For them, history is a reflexive conversation that surprises, delights, engages, and sometimes enrages. But that combination and the creative tension that goes with it is what defines their work. Throughout this historical map of Chester, they bring to life our city and the people who've worked and laboured in it. And it's great to see the university in all of this. The University of Chester was founded as a teacher training college in 1839 by a group of local leading figures, including Prime Minister William Gladstone. And it was the first purpose-built teacher training college, and as such is a very long-established educational institution. Since we were founded in 1839, we've grown significantly. We've now got something like 14,000 students. We have a new medical school, and we're just taking our second cohort of medical students here at Chester. But it's really great to see the university featuring on this Historic Towns Trust map, and the initiative led by Tom and Katherine was funded by a small grant from Research England. In my view, that's money well spent. So we're really delighted to bring this historic map of Chester to the public. We hope that the residents of Chester and in the surrounding areas will be able to glean new insights about their important city, its fascinating past, and the influences that have been and we've seen on its development. And this takes them from 400 to 1900. So that's enough from me, I think. Thank you for listening, and I'll pass on now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul. We now have two talks about the map itself, how it was made, and what it tells us about Chester. There'll be a chance to ask questions after the talk, so please save your questions till then. The first to speak is Professor Keith Lilley, historical geographer at Queen's University Belfast, former trustee and chair of the Historic Towns Trust, and now honorary vice president. Keith's own research on Chester's form and development was one of the drivers behind the Chester project, and it contributed importantly to the information on the map and gazetteer. So over to you, Keith.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Vanessa. Good evening, everybody. Great to be here. I have got some slides, so I will just find those for us and go to share screen. And I'm hoping this will be visible for everybody. All good? Yep. Yes. Okay. So, as Vanessa said, I'm Professor of Historical Geography at Queen's University Belfast, but a long association with the Historic Towns Trust. And it's fantastic to see the Chester historical map launched, published, finished. Although maps are finished, they actually often invoke further conversations, and that's what we really hope will happen. And I'm sure Tom and Katherine as well, through the kind of activities that Paul mentioned, the outreach activities, we'll see a lot of use of this map, not just in Chester, but in other places as well, I hope, because as Vanessa mentioned, one of the sort of reasons behind these maps for us as the Historic Towns Trust is to enable comparative research. And Chester, of course, is a fantastic city with a very rich heritage, as I'm sure many of us know. But equally, many of the other places featured on our maps, including places like York or Oxford, Winchester, and so on, are also really interesting and fascinating cathedral cities with Roman heritage and, in many cases, upstanding medieval defences. So they lend themselves to comparative study. But we're here to celebrate and mark the publication of Chester, which is, for me personally, a really great thing to see happen. I've got a long association really with Chester, going back over a few years now, having started research on the city. And I want to just say a few words this evening, really, about how I made a contribution, a small contribution, but I hope useful contribution to the project, going back a few years and working on a project called Mapping Medieval Chester, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which the organisation that Paul mentioned. Maps are a wonderful window onto the past, and we'll see that with the historical map of Chester. And of course, Chester itself has a very rich heritage and it's complicated. And the way the map helps us with that is it helps us to navigate the different layers that comprise the modern city today. So these are layers laid down over centuries, indeed, in Chester's case, over millennia, really. It's a very complex and multifaceted and multi-layered city. And what we want to try and do in historical maps is to actually help people to understand and visualize those complex histories, those spatial developments over time and space. Those of you from Chester will recognize this view. So this, I think, encapsulates the vibrancy of that very rich heritage that the city has, and which really ought to be very widely recognized, not just obviously in Chester, but well beyond as well. So how does a map help us to understand the layers of the city? Well, the map itself, this is the map we're talking about, the new town and city historical map of Chester. The map itself is multi-layered. It's made up of different layers of information related to different periods of the past. And that, I think, is its real value. Although the map it is a kind of composite of these different layers, these different time periods, it's still comprehensible to us. There's enough on the map relating to the city as it is today, even though it's based on a map of 1911, we can pick out the railway station, we can pick out the river, we can pick out St. Werburgh's, we can pick out the streets, and all these different geographical features and topographical features that characterize Chester today are readily visible on the map. But equally, we can move down through the historic layers, if you like, through the stratigraphy, the deposits that have accumulated in Chester over all those centuries. And the map itself helps us to do that really by drawing a distinction and a separating out the medieval layers, which if you lower down, from what we call the post-medieval, those are the period after the medieval period, after the Reformation, in the British context around the middle part of the 16th century. So the map really distinguishes between medieval features and post-medieval features, but also the labels on the map also highlight features from different time periods, right the way back, in fact, to Roman times. So it's another way we can use the map to help us to navigate the complexities of the past that has shaped Chester to become the city that we see today as represented on the map. So the map kind of invites us to look at the city with new eyes, with fresh eyes, I hope, to understand how it came to be today, but also to enjoy it in the field. I love to take maps in the field, and this is a folding map, so it's easily stuck in your pocket, and you can take it out into the streets and unravel it and unfold it and identify features on the map which are still visible today in Chester, but also some things which are not visible. And it's those invisible or less easy to see things which I was able to say something about in a project called Mapping Medieval Chester, Place and Identity in English Borderland City, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And it was a collaborative project with colleagues at that point in time in the University of Swansea, Katherine Clark and Helen Fulton, myself at Queen's University Belfast, and a postdoctoral researcher, Mark Faulkner, who was working with Katherine and Helen. Helen is also a trustee of the Historic Towns Trust and has been very closely involved with producing maps, including a very nice one of medieval Bristol. But there's a whole series of projects which are digital humanities-based projects, but focusing on the use of digital technologies to create new maps of medieval urban landscapes. And the Mapping Medieval Chester project was part of that suite of projects I was involved with about 15 years ago when we were working on this. And as part of that project, Mapping Medieval Chester, we were interested to try and recreate through a map what the city looked like for a particular point in time. We chose 1500 as that particular point in time. And our town and city historical map, which is what you're seeing here, draws on some of the information that we put together for Mapping Medieval Chester, and especially for those medieval features which over time have disappeared. And a good example of that are the friaries of the Mendicant orders, which were situated just within the walls on the western side of the city. So they're no longer visible to us today in Chester's landscape. But through using archaeological information, we were able to actually locate where those features, where those friaries stood. So that's just one example we can bring to light from the past, these medieval lost features, so that we can revisit the sites where they once stood using the historical map of Chester. So I'm just going to focus in a little bit more in that one area there to show you how we used maps and archaeological data in Mapping Medieval Chester to create a new map of Chester for circa 1500, and use now the same information from that map to create some of the information that you see on the Historic Towns Trust map. So we're looking here then, as I said, at the area along the western side of Chester in the medieval period. Here it is on the map on the right hand side. This is one of our maps from Mapping Medieval Chester, and you'll see a certain resemblance there. And I've highlighted for you the priories, the houses of the Mendicant orders, which were situated in an area just to the west of the main built-up area of the city at the time in the medieval period, and just inside the walls, the extension of the walls, which were, I think, of the early 12th century. I'll be corrected by Tom and Katherine, I'm sure, in due course, the experts on this. So let's focus in a little bit more then on those features. They are highlighted in purple on my Chester circa 1500 map, along with other medieval features there. The streets, the roads, of course, really important in the context of Chester, the city wall, its gates, earthworks and the castle and these things. But the purple features are medieval institutional buildings, including, of course, the cathedral. So let's just look a little bit more detail at how we got to that point. The basis of our Mapping Medieval Chester were these lovely, gorgeous, very rich Ordnance Survey maps of a very large scale, 1 to 500 in scale. And they show a huge amount of detail, even the interior of buildings, which I'm not sure if my mouse will work here, but if you look at the cathedral over here, you'll see the columns are represented, the cloister and so on. So there's a huge amount of detail. And these maps are accurate. And I think that's the other important point to make about the town and city historical map. These are accurate. They're based upon modern survey data and modern surveyed maps like the Ordnance Survey large scale maps like this one here. So the maps themselves can be brought into a geographical information system, which is what we did for Mapping Medieval Chester. It looks a little antiquated now because the software we now use looks a little bit different to what we're seeing here, but this is what we used in about 2010 when this work was done. All those little yellow dots that you see there on the screen here, all those little yellow dots are places where Lorraine Barry, my colleague at Queen's at the time, was with her GPS, differential GPS, out in the field and field surveying certain key points. And then we could check the accuracy of the Ordnance Survey map, and it is very accurate. But equally important is the historic maps which you can bring into the GIS, and also maps which relate to the archaeology of the city. And we were really lucky to work with Simon Ward, very fortunate to work with Simon Ward, formerly the city archaeologist for Chester. And he gave us a lot of advice, but also a lot of very useful maps, including maps of those lost houses of the mendicant orders, which he and others had been excavating. So the little map on the left-hand side there, the inset, is one of those maps from Simon Ward's publications. And what we have to do within the GIS is bring all that information together. And that's what we do. And we also add textual information, so information about the names of features as they were at some point in the past. So features like streets, for example, here, as you can see, called attributes in these attribute tables, all within this geographical information system. And on the back of the geographical information system, then we can produce our maps, which are, as I said, a kind of composite, bringing together historic maps, bringing together archaeological survey work, bringing together our own survey work. And if you go to this website here, Mapping Medieval Chester website, you'll see the maps which we produced. They're all thematic. So we have Chester, parishes, secular Chester, ritual Chester, civic Chester, ecclesiastical Chester, and Chester streets, as well as Chester 1500. And they're downloadable as PDFs. So they're accessible for you. But of course, we want you to buy that map, the new map, of course, is an important thing. So the one of the examples which we produced from Map of Medieval Chester was this one, Ecclesiastical Chester circa 1500. And there you can see all the ecclesiastical or religious features of late medieval Chester highlighted. So the mendicant orders, the housing mendicant orders, are these ones identified over here on the west side of the city centre. So it's those features then which we were able, through Giles Darkes' work as the cartographer on this project, working with Tom and with Katherine very closely, and also others at the University of Chester, drawing together that information to produce this final, what I think is an amazing and really beautiful map of a very interesting, a very beautiful city. So it was a great privilege to be part of that project. I was very proud and pleased that we could use some of Mapping Medieval Chester and feed into the final product here. So I'm happy to take any questions later on. If anybody wants to find out anything more about the GIS or the survey work or the data we used, but that's, I think, enough from me for now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Keith. And as I say, we will be taking questions in the chat later on. Next up, speaking either with one voice or one after another, are Tom Pickles and Katherine Wilson, historians at the University of Chester. I don't think they need any further introduction from me after Paul's introduction, but I should say that they are the real authors of the map, coordinating research and information, both for the map and for the gathering of information for the gazetteer on the reverse, as well, of course, as planning events associated with the project. So over to you, Tom and Katherine.
Well, thank you very much, Vanessa and Paul and Keith. That's really kind from everyone. And Keith has done part of my job for me, so thank you very much. Katherine and I are going to speak about the process of mapping historic Chester. And I'm going to do the majority of the speaking, but Katherine is coming in with one of her favourite sites to talk about that later on. That doesn't reflect our usual practice or our contributions, but just the fact that Katherine has a vestibular disorder at the moment to do the balance. So speaking on screen is quite tough. So I'm going to take the majority of the text today. Everyone who interacts with this HTT historical map of Chester, or indeed any of them, will approach those maps from their own perspectives. They'll have varying levels of knowledge and understanding about the city that they're looking at, and they'll inevitably get different things from it. Neither of us can properly anticipate what you might discover and what it'll mean to you. And indeed, I know that various people who are present tonight or have collaborated with us on the map know more than we do. So I suspect they will get very different things out of it from us. What we can do, though, is reflect briefly, hopefully, on how the process of creating the map has transformed our knowledge and understanding of the city. The HTT map process is very exciting, so I can recommend it to anyone who might be thinking of taking one on. HTT cartographer Giles Darkes, who's already been mentioned, presents you with a digitized version of a large-scale ordnance survey map from the early 20th century. He's already introduced us to this, and asks you to identify the historic features on that map, challenge in itself. Then asks you to create a gazetteer of historically significant sites from the beginnings of the city up to the 20th century, which will feature on the reverse of the map. And then, as Keith has mentioned, you're asked to provide spatial data for those lost historic sites that can then be mapped. And you've already seen this. This is the end result, the early 20th century digitized map with all of that spatial data expertly added onto it by Giles. Now, we were very lucky in approaching this for Chester. Not being the experts on Chester, we were fortunate to have a 2-volume Victoria County history for the city, which was produced in the 2000s under the editorship of Alan Thacker and Chris Lewis. And you can go and read that because it was published in the 2000s, but is now available digitally via the Institute of Historical Research website. You can see it here under Victoria County History, Counties A to Z, Cheshire. So go and have a look at that. That provides a huge wealth of historical information, which can be extracted to think about the gazetteer of sites and the detail that you want to present on the reverse of the map. We were equally fortunate to have some amazing historical books on the city, which if you haven't engaged with them, many of you will have done, then please do. We have, of course, wonderful overview books by Peter Carrington, his English heritage book on Chester, and by Simon Ward, who's already been mentioned. We also have some really useful period-specific books, and there are loads to choose from, but I'm going to particularly mention David Mason's books on Roman Chester and Anglo-Saxon Chester, and Jane Lawton on later medieval Chester. And indeed, we were really lucky that Peter and Simon and David very helpfully responded to queries, made suggestions to us, and in some cases read whole drafts of the text. We can also draw on the Chester Archaeological Society and its journal, which provides an enormous amount of historical and archaeological research on aspects of the city. Then, of course, we had Mapping Medieval Chester and all of that digital data. So by the time the map came to us, Giles had already added a huge volume of historical data to that map. So where did we begin? We started with a wonderful team of undergraduate history students. They were working on our second year history module. It's called Experiential Learning, Historical Research Methods and Practice. That module asks us to set real-world briefs to produce a genuine product at the end. So I gave them 2 maps, the Canterbury and Coventry map, and said, produce an HTT map gazetteer with illustrations for me. And they took those. They categorized the types of sites that would be included. They looked at the length of the entries. They divided up the work between themselves. They went off. They looked at the VCH and they looked at those other historical surveys of the city and JCAS. And they went through the Cheshire Image Bank and the Grosvenor Museum collection to think about potential images that we might use to illustrate it. And they drafted the whole thing. It was on the basis of that draft that we were able to ask the university to fund production of the final map. And we were able to use it too for 2 really important public engagement events at the Chester Heritage Festival and at the Chester Festival of Ideas, with thanks to them for hosting us. That allowed us to draw together a larger team of volunteers. Everybody's thanked in the acknowledgements on the map itself. And we were able to work with Cheshire Archives and Local Studies and the Grosvenor Museum and indeed the Archaeological Society too. So it's nice to be described as the real authors of the map, but to be honest, we have been collaborators and directors and trying to draw on this wealth of knowledge. Putting all this together and rewriting that gazetteer transformed our knowledge for us. It forced us to find out about aspects of the city across time with which we'd been unfamiliar. It also transformed our understanding though, because it encouraged us to think about how the topography influenced the historic development of the city. And we're going to start by talking about that issue, how the topography influenced the historic development of the city. And then we're going to pick a couple of sites to suggest how we were inspired to go off and find out more about places, and how we hope you will be too. Chester, as a lot of you will know, has its origins in a Roman fortress named from the river Deva. You can see it here on Giles Darkes' fantastic plan overlain on the city, which sits on the reverse of the map. And you can see it too in Julian Baum's excellent reconstruction as it would have looked in the mid-3rd century and showing that topographical location. The Romans chose a topographically strategic location, which has been crucial to the historic development of the city. They sited the fortress on a sandstone outcrop, which terminates in the Wirral to the north, creating a connection between the city and the Irish Sea overland. This was also a hogback of land which sloped away to the river. They built it adjacent to the lowest bridgeable point on the River Dee, where the river flows westwards through a restricted gorge and then loops northwards, forming a natural harbour. And this is also a navigable point on the Dee. All of this established a position that facilitated the development of urban defences using the River Dee as a natural boundary, but it also constrained that urban development. It encouraged Chester's long-term role as a seaport too, a role that's very easy to overlook because the last seagoing vessels visited the city in the 1940s. Following the abandonment of the Roman fortress, the Anglo-Saxons constructed a burh or fortified town in the 10th century. And after the Norman conquest, new city walls were laid out in the course of the 12th century. You can see on the map on the left that the Anglo-Saxons probably reused the Roman fortress in various ways. You can see, and hopefully you can see my mouse marking this out, the extent of the Roman fortress preserved in the city's street plans. This suggests to us that they reused the fortress defences. They may also have reused some of the tracks, like the perimeter tracks. And they seem to have taken what was the major east-west and south route and reused it, but extended the route from the North Gate all the way down to the Cross. They then re-employed some of the existing small streets in the Roman fortress and added to these others to create a grid plan, with smaller streets at right angles to those main north-south and east-west routes. They probably extended the defences at the north, westwards, to the river, and at the east, southwards to the river, creating a larger enclosed fortified area. And you can see that after the Norman conquest, a similar line in the course of the 12th century was marked out by the city walls, which are preserved for us on the current map. And just to illustrate the importance of this over the longue durée to the development of the city, you can go and look at Martin Moss of Dextra Visual, his excellent reconstruction of the city as it was in the 18th century, focused particularly on the castle. You can see a still from this on the right, with the Dee Bridge and what had been the medieval defences running around the outside of the city. The implications of this development from Roman fortress to burh to medieval city were manifold. The first implication is that the city, of course, was inextricably bound up with its role as a seaport. It wasn't just a city, it was a river as well. The city had jurisdiction from upriver at Heron Bridge all the way down to Arnold's Eye at Hillborough Point by the tip of Wirral. A second implication was that the city therefore had to adapt to the changing circumstances of the river. And there's all sorts that could be said about this. Now, it's possible that there was a 10th century strand or landing point for boats beneath St. John's Church. It's been suggested that this was a place where Viking traders might have landed, who perhaps commemorated themselves with the Hiberno-Norse circle-headed crosses, which we find in St. John's Church. More certainly, the principal medieval quays were to the south on the Ship Gate, which is marked on the map by the bridge gate, and to the west, led to by the Watergate. and out on the western side of the city. But the shifting sands and the silting of the Dee mean it's very difficult to imagine these as quays today. To confront that issue, the silting and the shifting sands, new outports were created to allow seagoing vessels to offload their cargoes at different points on the river. The port pool first at the northwest limit of the city liberties from the 1200s to the 1400s, then at Shotwick from 1449, and then further afield successively at Burton, Denhall in Ness, Neston, Gayton, Heswall, Redbank or Dorpool in Thurstaston, and at Point of Ayre in Flintshire. From 1674, it became clear that an artificial channel was required to ensure seagoing vessels could reach the city. And this was fulfilled finally by the Dee Cut, created from 1734 to 7 and maintained by the River Dee Company from 1741 onwards. And this was served by the then new, Crane Wharf, which is what you see marked on the map, top left. Magnified it for us. The third point is that the city had to exploit topographically constrained natural resources to support its population for most of its history. Think of the springs at Bourton for its water supply, which are what's magnified on the top right, or the waters of the Dee at the Causeway, which were used to yield fish from weirs and power the mills for processing cereals and cloth, which is what's magnified here for us with the Dee Bridge and the Causeway, Dee Mills and Deeside Mills. And these had a very long-term influence on the city, but they have been superseded, in particular the mills, in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, meaning, again, it's easy to miss their significance. A fourth observation is that this location and the changes to the Dee and this evolution from fortress to burh to city resulted in some areas of the city free from development for long periods. Some are difficult to imagine as being empty spaces or less occupied spaces, but some are very easy to imagine in that way still to the present day. We've already seen the crofts. Keith has introduced us to it. This is a strip of land that you can see from the northern walls at the northwest corner, stretching down to the castle back up. It's a broad strip of land between the western limits of occupation and the western city walls. The castle was located here from the late 11th century, and in the 12th century we had the foundation of the associated Benedictine nunnery of St Mary and our two friaries, which have already been mentioned. But even with the introduction of those two elements, the crofts remained a largely unoccupied space, a very green space within the city, until the post-Reformation period, when those plots were sold off with the dissolution of those institutions, and gradually settlement developed within the crofts. Nevertheless, an area of the crofts to the north remained largely unoccupied until the late 18th and 19th centuries. We can think too of the Rue Dee, which is much more obviously an empty space in the city. Originally, this was a tidal salt marsh, but by about 1200, it was probably a meadow covered each tide, and then by about 1300, it was probably dry. In the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, it belonged to the city, free from tithe, the payment expected to the church, and leased for summer grazing as meadow pasture. Unsurprisingly then, as a big open space, it's hosted lots of public events, civic events, political meetings, the mustering of soldiers, archery, trial by battle, bowls. I like to think that archery, trial by battle and bowls are largely equivalent. Horse racing from 1539 onwards to the present day. Circuses, as is not quite the case, but fairs certainly in the present day. And the Royal Agricultural Society show in 1858. Most obscure of all, though, is the area just outside the northwest of the medieval city walls, known as the Gorse Stacks, and that's what's magnified up on the right. This was Hunwaldersloe in 1336, an Old English name meaning Hunwald's Mound. And it makes me wonder whether what we've got is a real or imagined burial mound. Commonly, these were places for gathering in the Anglo-Saxon period and for a range of activities. It was subsequently the Gorse Stacks by 1543. We've got a reference to the watering place commons at Cow Lane End in 1586, and this indicates common land reached by Cow Lane, Horn Lane and Bag Lane, and taken in quite a wide area. Gore Stacks, George Street, Brook Street, Bowling Green Bank, Frodsham Street and Milton Street. Again, there was a range of public open-air activities. During the 1500s, it was the horse market, and in the 1900s, as you can see here, the city cattle market. Gore Stacks comes from the fuel stored for the city bakeries. A range of place names suggest other activities. A middens, a rubbish pit at Pudding Hill, a bowling green at Bowling Green Bank, a cockpit, presumably for cockfighting at Cockpit Hill, a lists, meaning a place for jousting at Justin Croft, and a watering place for horses at Greg's Pit. So lots of missing elements to the city that you can reconstruct from the map. A fifth and final thing to note is that these combined factors might help to explain the emergence of Chester's most distinctive feature, the rows. You can see them marked on the map, stolen from the outlines from mapping medieval Chester down the four main streets, and they perhaps originated in the area known as the Selds. This is one hypothesis, and where we have our common hall that I'm going to come back to later as well, or just adjacent to it. The seaport made the city a major centre for trade, as we're going to hear. And Peter Carrington of the English Heritage Book of Chester has recently argued, and you can go and see these talks online, that the hogback of land prompted the Romans to create terracing, and that the uneven street levels in turn prompted our medieval builders to create buildings with cellars which were at the ground floor to the front, even though the ground floor was at the first floor to the rear. And that created shops above with their ground floor at the rear, but first floor continuous galleries to the front. And you can see that represented here on a Chester Archaeological Society isometric reconstruction of the Lesh house with the cellar and the shop and continuous galleries, and then the chambers above. And you can see it represented on one of many wonderful Louise Rayner watercolours from the turn of the century, 1900, in the Grosvenor Museum collection. Well, these were the things that producing the map prompted us to think about in relation to the topography and the historic development of the city. And what struck us is that during the later 18th and 19th century, industrialisation and exponential urban growth underpinned changes to the city, which worked with this existing landscape, but also served to obscure many of its features. To introduce new methods of transport, it was necessary to avoid the occupation areas of the medieval city in many cases, and its northern and eastern suburbs. But it was also necessary to utilise the position of the Dee Cut and Crane Wharf. So the Dee Basin, which you can see here, was created for the Shropshire Union Canal to link it to the seaport and the river, which stretches along the northern side of the city. This was reinforced by the routes of the railways meeting at Chester General Station, but coming in, as you can see, across the Rue Dee and clipping the northwest corner of the city and travelling out to the north and to the east in parallel to the canal. And suburbs expanded around these new transport and communication routes, really changing the landscape of the city as you can see it on the map. To provide utilities, the old Boughton Springs acquired a waterworks and pumping station, and between the Rue Dee and the Dee Basin around Crane Wharf was the natural place for the gasworks and the electricity station, which are marked on the map. To deliver social services, some of the remaining open places were exploited. Adjacent to the Rue Dee, in and amongst these utilities, was the Chester Workhouse, the Chester Union Workhouse. And on the northern parts of the Crofts, just up here, you'll see marked on the map the Chester Royal Infirmary, built in 1771, and the Chester City Jail, built in 1807, subsequently replaced by the Queen's School as it stands. Within all of this topographical and historical development, we like the way the map allows us to identify the location of particular sites and go off to investigate their significance. To illustrate this, Katherine's chosen the Water Tower and I've chosen the Hospital of St Ursula. So I'll go and hand over to Katherine at this point.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you for taking us through that. So for me, it's the Water Tower. And it always has been the Water Tower ever since I arrived at the University of Chester in 2012. And so the Water Tower was an extension to the northwest corner of the city walls. A context for it is probably Edward II's garrisoning and provisioning of castles such as those at Beeston, Denbigh and Holt, prompting the city to consider its own defences. In 1322, John of Helpston was placed under contract to construct it for the sum of £100, and it may have been completed around about 1325. Now, based on parallels with Edward I's castles constructed under the direction of Master James of St George, John was perhaps inspired by these earlier works, especially at Conway, and he created a spur wall terminating in a round tower. Now, the tower originally reached into the Dee. It was likely there to observe shipping and enforce tolls on the goods that were brought in there. But within a century, as the story goes, the silting of the Dee undermined its original function. And of course now, if you go there, it looks over a park, not situated in the water at all. But thanks to, again, UKRI AHRC funded project that I oversaw, which was the mobility of objects across boundaries, 1700, we can again watch the excellent reconstruction that was provided by Martin Moss of Dextra Visual of the Water Tower as it was in that mid-14th century. And this is a still of which illustrates the map gazetteer entry. So the Water Tower for me is always a reminder of Chester's role as a node in a network of international cities, and in particular a node in two interlinked routes via the Irish Sea to the Atlantic seaboard of France and Spain, and via London to the Low Countries and Germany. So first, the Wirral was a point of transshipment to Chester for heavier cargoes like wine and millstones, which were then transferred into smaller crafts capable of navigating the Dee to Chester or into carts for transport overland. Second, the port pool was a docking point for medium-sized vessels carrying fish, Welsh slates, woolen cloth, hardware and malt. And third, the new tower or Watergate was the immediate destination for smaller vessels. And you get around about an average of 40 to 50 ships per year from the 1420s through to the 1500s. And these ships travelled between Chester, Ireland, Brittany, Gascony, Spain and Portugal. And we have records of Irish ships that are recorded as coming in from Dublin, Howth, Malahide and Rush, carrying sea fish, salmon, hides, cloth and yarn from Ireland, and then returning with salt, wine, high quality woolens and textiles and metal pots and pans. We also have records of ships from Brittany and Gascony arriving with Breton canvas, Gascony wine, alum, dyestuffs, honey, linen cloth, pitch, tar, oil, salt, vinegar and woad. And ships from Spain, particularly from the later 1480s onwards, brought stuff such as wine, iron and oil, some angora, silk, velvet, licorice, my personal favourite, and skins. And then from 1509 we have cork, dyestuffs, figs, raisin, litmus, pepper, herbs, oil, sugar, wax and sweet wines. In the context of exporting goods to Ireland, control or purchase imported items for redistribution and furnish the people of Chester with particular wares. And Chester was a focus for traders travelling from overland from elsewhere in the English kingdom. So you might see fish being exchanged with people from Staffordshire for metal horse trappings, from Warwickshire for size, and from Worcestershire for fruit and wood ash. Sorry, Worcestershire always throws me off as a Scot, that one there. And cloth was also brought from Lancashire, Cumbria and Yorkshire in return for furs. Two cities also developed particularly close relationships with Chester. So we have Coventry via the trade, important trade in cloth, wine, and also dyestuffs for horses, furs, and fish. And of course, London via the trade in cloth, mercery wares, sweet wine, dyestuffs, paper, figs, and raisins. So for this is Chester as our node in a network. It makes Chester a location with merchants from many places. In the period 1538 to 42, the evidence permits us to say that Chester freemen comprised only 40 to 45% of traders. The rest were English, Welsh, Irish, and continental merchants. I'll hand back over to Tom now for his favourite place on the map.
Okay, with all that context in mind, it almost appears that we've spoken to each other about this. We can switch over to the Hospital of St Ursula, which you can see here. This was the former Common Hall in Common Hall Street. We have the hospital and St Thomas Smith's almshouses here. You can see an illustration of them on the right, which we used on the reverse of the map for the gazetteer. And this comes from the Frank Simpson manuscripts at Cheshire Archives and Local Studies, references on your right there, just to give you a visual image. The Hospital of St Ursula in Common Hall Lane comprised a hospital with a chapel in the old Common Hall. Its connection with what Katherine's just said about is that it originated in a bequest by Roger Smith, probably the citizen and wool merchant admitted a freeman in 1494-5 and made a sheriff in 1499. Smith bequeathed his house on Common Hall Lane as a charitable institution to be kept by the mayor of the city and his brethren for men who'd held office and fallen into decay and necessity. His executors created a chantry or hospital dedicated to St Ursula, with a fraternity or guild, 6 almshouses erected under oversight of the fellowship or company of the mercery on a void piece of land for the use of the men or for their wives. The fraternity was ultimately dissolved and the chapel sold off in 1547 following the dissolution of the monasteries. But the hospital continued as Sir Thomas Smith's almshouses under trustees from 1702. But in the end, the houses were sold off by auction in 1871 and demolished. So this is another of our long-lived but lost features of the city landscape. Well, I ended up thinking about this because I went looking for the potential owner of the ring up on the right, which is a portable antiquities scheme find of a ring dedicated to Jesus, Mary and John and the Magi. And I wondered who might have owned one of these. I think the key to understanding the hospital is the link between the Cologne, the Magi, Ursula, and the Mercers, or the textile merchants. But I'm not a late medievalist, so it may be that someone else needs to go off and research this properly. Originally in Constantinople, the relics of the Magi were translated by Bishop Eustogius I of Milan to Milan in 314, and then by the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa and his bishop Reinald of Dassel, Bishop of Cologne, to Cologne in 1164. They were housed in an elaborate shrine created by the goldsmith Nicholas of Verdun. The Magi were particularly connected with the protection of travellers, which may be their interest to the Mercers as merchants who were travelling a lot, and they were invoked in charms against cramp and against what we call epilepsy, the falling sickness. The story of Ursula, connected with the Magi and Cologne, may be related in outline from the widely disseminated 13th century text, Jacob de Voren's Golden Legend, and you can see it illustrated by the so-called Master of the Small Passion from around about 1411 at the bottom of your screen. According to this version of the text, Ursula was the daughter of a Christian king of Britain. She was courted by a pagan English king, too powerful to be refused. Ursula experienced a vision, an angelic vision, instructing her to marry the prince, but on conditions. The first being his conversion to Christianity, second being his provision of 10 noble virgins, each with a retinue of another 1,000 virgins, and the third being a 3-year interval before they could marry. The king accepted these terms, and Ursula and her new companion sailed to Rome and returned via Cologne, but they were martyred in Cologne by pagans, and they were martyred alongside the Pope and her fiancé, the king, at least according to the story. So Cologne connects for us the Magi and Ursula. Cologne was also a major Hanseatic trading centre with a special role in the cloth trade, and the Cologne Steel Yard was, as I understand it, one of the largest and most important communities of alien merchants in London, the Mercers. And it's been suggested they had a special relationship with the Magi and Ursula. If we come back to Chester, for the Chester mystery plays of the later Middle Ages, it's the Mercers Guild who were responsible for the play about the Magi. And I wonder whether it might be a wealthy merchant, a mercer, who had that ring dedicated to the Magi. It's a plausible suggestion, I think. At the same time, to show the currency of the cult of Ursula, somewhere near Chester, in about 1440, the manuscript Aberdeen manuscript 123, folios 132V to 136R, was written. And this included a new element in the cult of St. Ursula, so-called Shropshire miracle. We're told that one John of Warwick was sent to Langley in Shropshire, where a demon was deceiving the locals by pretending to be an angel and feigning miracles. The demon attempted to drown John in a pool. However, Ursula's voice commanded the demon to confess, who stated that he'd started a war and stirred over 30,000 men to attack the church. Ursula commanded John to find the men and stop them by using a secret sign, but unfortunately for John, his unusual behaviour meant that he was imprisoned with other heretics, Lollards, near Havering. But the story claims he refused, even under threat of decapitation, to swear to those Lollard ordinances to their beliefs. So the Chester mystery plays, our ring, and this Cheshire manuscript with its Shropshire miracle suggest a connection between the Mercers, the Magi, and perhaps also the cult of Ursula. And this might explain why our Mercers, acting as the executors for Smith, used the old common hall and his house to give it over to St. Ursula. To conclude then, we hope that the map will encourage you to go off and create such wild claims as these about historic aspects of Chester, find out more about them and promote Chester's extraordinary heritage. And we hope too that you will start doing what we've started doing, which is looking at Chester in its European context, comparing it with those other European cities and of course the other cities that the HTT has been mapping. There is a wealth of comparative information to be gained from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both Katherine and Tom. I mean, I wasn't part of doing the map, but and so these stories are completely new to me, but it's really wonderful to hear the richness that you've been able to bring to that. In a moment, we'll be opening this up for questions, which can be directed to Keith or to Tom or to Katherine or also to Giles. But rather than trying to manage raised hands and spoken interventions, as I say, we're asking people to write their questions in the chat, and I'll then read them out, perhaps grouping or gathering questions on a similar theme and direct them to the team to answer. But in the meantime, while you are gathering your thoughts, I want to say a little bit more about what we're doing with the map. We've got the map now. How can we make sure that more people know about the map? How can we encourage them to use it to enhance their understanding and appreciation of Chester? So one area that Historic Towns Trust is working on is the development of educational resources for school children, using our maps to help them learn about local history and geography and to gain a sense of belonging. These pictures were taken at a workshop for local school teachers held in Bath in March. And the workshop built on the historical map of Bath published in October last year, and you can see it spread out on the floor. And the workshop explored how that map might be used the experience and the insights that were gained at the workshop have now informed the development of a resource pack for teachers and children at Key Stage 2 based on the Bath map. This is something about what it's going to look like. What we'd like to do is to replicate this across the country wherever we have a map. We want to develop a resource pack for Chester, like the one for Bath, using Chester's map and exploring its distinctive history and features from the Rose to the Rue D. To forward that aim, Tom and Katherine are leading a workshop for teachers and educators on the 6th of July. And I understand that there are still some places available. So do please sign up there if you are a teacher, educator interested in participating. Now, as with everything the Historic Towns Trust does, we can bring together expertise and facilitate activities and projects, but we need outside funding for professional and practical inputs. So we're looking for funding for educational and outreach activities in Chester, those already planned, further developments and initiatives. So far, we've had generous support from the Earl of Chester's Fund, but creating and distributing education packs like those for Bath for Chester is estimated to cost up to another £5,000. So if you'd like to help with this or to contribute to our wider activities or to any of our other projects, please do donate using our webpage. Please gift aid your donation if you can, or get in touch with our development manager, Martin Wills, development@historictownstrust.uk. And it's also worth mentioning at this stage that we'd be very interested in moving on to a historical atlas of Chester, using the same map or a development of it as its centerpiece, but supporting it with a fuller narrative of Chester's history, illustrated by development maps, illustrations, and a full gazetteer. But that, of course, will be another fundraising campaign. Back to the map itself. If you don't already have a copy or are interested in getting more, this is how to do so. There is a discount code for the next month. If you're from a trade group, this is who you contact to order it for your bookshop or whatever. But otherwise, please do get in touch with resources to find it. To conclude, as I said, the whole event has been recorded and will be on our YouTube channel. There are other recordings there too, including one on how the maps are made by Giles Darkes. But it's really good to be able to think of going back to listening to these talks again, to following through particularly what Keith, Tom and Katherine have said, and revisiting that in the light of having studied the map in greater detail. So now perhaps we can see what questions are coming up. I have a comment. Well, the comments are coming through thick and fast. The first one is from Rhys Emmett saying, considering the depth of Chester's history and its breadth as an economic centre, does the popular focus on the city's Roman history need to be broadened, presumably broadened out into thinking of other aspects of Chester? Perhaps this one goes to Tom, do you think?
Yes. I think people who are already interested in the historic development of Chester are already aware of this multi-layered history to it, and often aware of those resources that are available. But I think in the way that people who are not already interested in that history perceive the city and interact with it, and if we think about the way that it is often presented to the outside world, there is a very heavy focus on its Roman origins, which is terrific. But often that medieval and early modern period is overlooked. We could do with, I think, a really good online heritage resource to promote the city. And the Chester Heritage Festival have already begun that process. Their website is absolutely fantastic and has a series of talks that have been given over the decade that they've been running that are uploaded on there, and other resources to really engage with all the different periods of the city's history. But yes, I think it would be great. I think the Archaeological Society have long campaigned for the idea of a museum or a greater museum space, which would allow for the representation of the medieval and early modern collections, for instance, it would be great for people to be able to see those, many of which are housed in storage at the moment.
Thanks, Tom. Now, the next question is, do we have any plans for an interactive digital map that allows for layers, zooming in, and knowledge links? Perhaps I could just ask Giles to comment on our digital ambitions for a moment. But the question is a broader one for what we think we might do with this map. Giles, are you okay with that?
Yes, thanks very much, Vanessa. It is a good question. The way that the maps are created is that we are obviously working essentially in a digital environment, and specifically we make the maps using a program which is called Adobe Illustrator. And the way the maps are built up is that you actually build them up in layers. And as a result, what it means is that we can, in fact, extract layers, for example, just the medieval buildings, and create maps specifically from those. And we're looking at different ways of using that digital data and to actually make it available partly through our website, partly online, but also specifically for people who have, for example, research needs to actually use that data. But we're also very much aware that our target audience is the general public, people who are not perhaps professional historians, but people who are interested. And so we're actually exploring ways of making that information available. So we're always interested in people's suggestions for what we can actually do. You'll appreciate, as Vanessa was saying, that any development we do, of course, necessarily takes money. We need to buy in expertise to actually create some of this material. But we're very much interested in increasing our outreach, and looking at digital ways of interacting with the general public is one of those ways.
Thank you, Giles. And I think that also is a kind of answer to the next question, which is, are we thinking of QR codes for more in-depth information linking to Chester Heritage, Chester Civic Trust, Grosvenor Museum, and so on? I think that our digital aims are enormous, but our capacity is limited. We're always looking both for ideas, but also for partners who might be able to realize these in practice.
Vanessa, could I just come in there and just say,
yes.
I know that you have, just to advertise another HTT map, that you were holding an event in Scarborough, I think, for looking at an HTT map of Scarborough. And I was really struck, I haven't explored it enough yet recently, by the Scarborough Atlas online, scarboroughAtlas.org, which I think uses it might be the HuMap kind of software to present information, so you can click on it and it gives you little digests, bits of information. And we're struck by the possibility, not necessarily of doing the same thing, but for those in Scarborough producing it, these are really complementary resources, aren't they? So people could go and have a look at that. It's an interesting way of doing it that doesn't involve QR codes around the city as well, which can be complicated.
Right. Thanks, Tom. Yes. I think perhaps the next question comes back to you or Katherine. Did the process of bringing all these different layers of historical information into one map give you any eureka moments of things you hadn't really appreciated before? Which of you is going to go for that?
I will say, I think most of the eureka moments we've had, other people have had well before us. So I don't think there've been anything that would be enormously new to people who are familiar with Chester. But yeah, there were some moments for me, certainly, where for instance, the area that I mentioned at Bolton to the east of the city, which was, again, limits of the city's jurisdiction, where I hadn't really appreciated in close proximity the springs, there was a gallows, there was the leper hospital, and it brought to life for me that eastern entrance into the city. As you were coming in, what would happen when you crossed that liminal threshold, if you like, into the city's jurisdiction? You'd be aware of some of these things, I think, as you were passing through. It also made me want to know much more about the St Giles Hospital. I was recently reading someone's excellent work in Winchester, excavating the hospital there, and thinking, wow, it would be great to know much more about our leper hospital.
Great. A couple more comments on the QR codes and digital layers. Keith Lilley comments that the Coventry HTT map is a digital layer in the Coventry Atlas, which is online. And for those of you interested in London, our two maps of medieval and Tudor London are available or are visible in the website Layers of London, which literally layers maps from different periods, one on top of another. There are a couple of comments about QR codes, and there's a question just slightly further up. Could one of you say more about student engagement in enthusiasm for the project and what your plans are for the future, or whether that will continue?
Yeah, I can maybe take that one on, though, Tom, as you know, he explained in the talk how integral our students were to the starting off of the production of the map. And I think that was Sarah from Sarah Rees-Jones. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Nice. Thank you for coming along. Yes, it will continue. Student engagement. We are rolling out a new curriculum as we speak. We have our modules called both History at Work and Curious Chester, where we get the students to put history into practice, as it were, or to produce tangible outputs from the history that they are researching. And so this is really integral to our history degree. So we're planning to use the maps already with them, and then to develop perhaps some of the educational resources. We often do that with our students as well, so we'd be looking to involve them there. So hopefully it's a conversation, as we were saying, that can start and can continue, and then we can think about various ways, as we've heard here tonight, in which you can develop the map for the public or for educators, and we'd hope that our students will be partners with us in taking that forwards and with yourselves.
Thank you, Katherine. Yeah,
I think it's worth emphasising that Katherine has a PGCE, so what she does on History at Work, or has done in the past, is to take the students into schools to try out teaching resources. And we also work with the PGCE secondary at Chester, and the PGCE students in history in their network schools where they have placements, often for enrichment, take in the resources and try them out in the schools. So that's one direct way in which we will be trying to use the map, get it in schools, create resources, and then test resources, I think.
I always forget that aspect of my career a little bit sometimes, but yeah, absolutely. And we'd be looking perhaps even to start that as soon as when we've worked through with yourselves the resources from this map, and then getting them to practice in schools and seeing the feedback from the pupils and teachers.
I think those are all really exciting developments. The possibilities of getting in touch with the next generation and encouraging them to understand about maps and what maps can tell us and how they can use maps is really important to what we do. Let me follow that up. I think the other thing that this is illustrated, and particularly what you've both been talking about, is what a large-scale collaboration it is, in the sense that it's not just, you know, one or two academics working on a historical project. It's bringing in students, it's bringing in experts from outside the academy, it's working together with museums and location and archaeological units. All of these are really important partners. It's very striking from the Historic Towns Trust point of view is that each project is different. Each project has a different characteristic, a different group leading it, will reflect local interest in different ways. But this has been a particularly successful one in terms of engaging with the university and being able to work with university students. I think that's really been important. I think the questions are running out a bit now. Though there's quite a bit in the chat if anybody is interested in where the other maps might be available, as I say, Coventry, Bristol, London, and so on. Do we have any other questions? Looks as though people are, well, I hope what you're all doing is signing up and that we'll see a sudden burst in online sales of the Chester map using the discount code. Let me just perhaps put that up again. That reminds you where you can buy it and how you can get hold of it. But we are I think it's very important to say that the map is an achievement, but it's only the start of a new set of developments, lots of ways in which we can use it and take it forward. So, and Giles also points out that we have a newsletter which you can sign on to through our website. So I think perhaps at this point I could just conclude by thanking Keith, Katherine, Tom, Paul for speaking, Giles for answering questions, and all of you for attending. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned a bit more about Chester and the Chester map and will be part of us as we move forward. Thank you very much indeed.